Gerald Huxley made a living photographing what most people spend their lives trying to forget. He said he brought beauty to goodbye, but behind every image was profit dressed as empathy. When his camera began showing him faces that shouldn't exist, smiling corpses, open eyes in the dark, grief reflected backward. He blamed fatigue. Until one day, a picture refused to stay edited. This is the story of how one man tried to frame death and found himself trapped inside it. Subscribe and like for more stories from Karma's ledger, where every act leaves a shadow waiting to be seen. Gerald Huxley was 48, single by choice, and so precise he ironed his shoelaces. He'd once dreamed of art galleries and travel portfolios, but art doesn't pay rent, and grief, he discovered, did. He became the region's best-known memorial photographer, though the term was his own invention. He promised families dignified closure, the kind of elegance you could print and frame beside urns. The truth was less noble. He had a knack for turning raw emotion into aesthetic black and white shots of trembling hands, close-ups of wrinkled love, tears blurred by depth of field. He told himself it was mercy, capturing grace in the unbearable, but deep down he knew it was theft dressed as tribute. His camera, a faithful Leica M10, was his priest and confessor. It never judged him, never flinched, never blinked until the Lawson funeral. It was a wet spring morning, thunder stalking the edges of town. The Lawsons had lost their teenage son in a car accident. A sweet, quiet boy named Matthew. The service was small, all gray coats and swollen eyes. Gerald moved among them like a shadow, the perfect voyeur. The shutter clicks fell like heartbeats, steady, detached. When he lifted the lens toward the casket for the final shot, something shifted in the viewfinder. For a fraction of a second, Matthew's eyes were open. Not rolled back, not illusion open, calm, looking directly into the lens. Gerald froze, the camera beeped twice, memory card full. He stepped outside, chalk white under the drizzle, convincing himself it was fatigue, bad lighting, nerves. But when he checked the photos that evening, the boy's face had changed again. In the raw image, Matthew's expression was peaceful. In the edited version, exported automatically to his cloud drive, the corners of his mouth curved upward, smiling. He deleted it instantly, or thought he did. The next morning, the photo had reappeared in his portfolio under a folder name he hadn't created. For you, he stared at it until the monitor dimmed to black, the faint reflection of his own face hovering beside the boy's. The smile was no longer faint. It was knowing. Gerald spent the day convincing himself it was a glitch, some metadata corruption. He replaced his SD cards, formatted the drive, reinstalled everything. But each new project brought more distortions, uninvited faces in windows, reflections that didn't match the living, hands that reached where no one stood. When he zoomed in, he saw faint shapes behind the mourners, outlines of people who shouldn't be there, standing perfectly still, watching him. His reputation only grew. Families loved the photos, said they could feel their loved ones still near. The more unsettling the details, the more heartfelt the praise. "You captured his spirit," one woman said, sobbing with gratitude. Gerald smiled for the cameras but started sleeping with the lights on. He stopped editing at night. Still, the images kept uploading themselves, appearing in his folders like confessions he hadn't written. One evening, while cleaning his studio, he noticed something strange. Every photo he'd ever printed, hundreds of framed memories stacked in labeled boxes, had begun to warp slightly. Faces bending inward, eyes looking just past the viewer. In some, he thought he saw his own reflection, not looking through the lens, but trapped inside it. The first dream came that night. He was walking through a cemetery with his Leica swinging from his neck. Each gravestone had a photo attached, one of his own shots. As he passed, the subjects blinked awake, turning their gaze on him, mouths moving without sound. The wind carried a whisper, "Thank you for keeping us." He woke gasping, hands trembling so violently that his morning coffee shattered against the sink. When he checked his calendar, he realized the next job was in the same church as the Lawson funeral. He almost canceled, but pride was louder than fear. "You don't stop shooting because of nightmares," he told himself. "You master the light." Gerald didn't open the folder for 3 days. He renamed it twice, tried dragging it to the trash, even reset the whole computer, but it kept coming back. For you, always the same to words, always in the same pale gray font, sitting on his desktop like a dare. The first morning he ignored it. He convinced himself he'd beaten it, just a corrupted file. But then, while editing a wedding album, a photo slipped into the batch that didn't belong. The Lawson funeral again, the same smiling boy in the casket. He shut the laptop so hard the hinge cracked. When he opened it again, The desktop wallpaper had changed to that same image, Matthew's faint grin behind layers of digital static. That night, the folder pulsed again. He clicked it, more angry than afraid. Inside were hundreds of thumbnails photos he hadn't taken. Each image showed a funeral he'd worked, different faces, different years. Only now, every one of them had changed. The dead were no longer still. Their eyes were open, faint smiles curling their lips. Behind them, blurred but visible, was him, always him, standing in the background, the leaker raised, his breathing turned shallow. He scrolled faster, the images blending into one continuous pattern, the same composition, the same haunting symmetry. The only difference was that, in each successive photo, he stood a little closer to the casket. He unplugged the computer, ripped the battery from his camera, shut off the lights, and sat in darkness until dawn. He didn't sleep. He didn't dream. But in the early morning stillness, the faint mechanical click of a shutter came from the corner of the room, slow and deliberate. He turned on the lamp. The camera sat where he'd left it, lens shattered, power off. Yet the red indicator light blinked. Click. Then again. Click. He covered it with a towel. Hard hammering. By the end of the week, his bookings had dropped. Word spread that Gerald Huxley's work had grown unsettling. A widow claimed she saw her late husband standing beside her in one of the prints. Another family said a shadow over their child's casket matched the shape of the photographer himself. Gerald stopped answering calls. He unplugged from the internet. Still, the folder returned on borrowed laptops, on a studio assistant's phone, once even printed on contact sheets that he hadn't developed. It followed him like memory or debt. He started drinking again, something he hadn't done since the early days of his career. Whiskey blurred the edges, but not enough. One night, in a haze of exhaustion and fear, he wrote an email to Father Delaney. "I think I photographed something I shouldn't have. I think it's following me." He never sent it. The draft disappeared before his hand reached the mouse. The next morning, the email was in his inbox instead, as if someone had replied. The subject line read, "For you." The message body contained a single attachment, his own photo from the Lawson funeral, and one line beneath it, "Thank you for keeping us." He smashed the monitor, the camera, anything that could record, but the sounds didn't stop. Shutters, faint as rain, clicking through the house, room to room, steady as a pulse. He began covering mirrors, windows, any reflective surface. Even in darkness, he could feel their gaze, the weight of every face he'd ever captured, thousands of small eternities looking back, wanting something he didn't know how to give. When Father Delaney finally visited, answering the silence after weeks of missed appointments, he found the studio shuttered, curtains drawn. On the table were dozens of photographs spread like cards, each one showing Gerald asleep in his chair. Every night, a new one had been printed and stacked neatly on top of the last. In the last image, he was awake, eyes open, staring straight into the lens. And just behind him, faint but visible, a young boy in a coffin was smiling. The next morning broke gray and hollow. Gerald woke in his chair, throat raw, light bleeding through blinds that hadn't been opened in weeks. The room smelled of photochemicals and rain. On the floor, the prints he didn't remember taking formed a crooked path leading toward the window. Each one was of him slumped in that same chair, but from slightly different angles, as if whoever held the camera had been circling closer each night. He tried to tell himself it was sleepwalking, some twisted act of self-sabotage, but his hands trembled when he picked up the last photo. In it, he was staring directly into the camera, mouth slightly open, and in the faint reflection on the glass pane behind him, something pale and small hovered at his shoulder the shape of a boy. He tore the photo in half, then quarters until it was pulp. But the whisper started the moment the pieces hit the floor. It was the sound of film running through an old projector, quiet but constant. He pressed his palms against his ears, but it wasn't in the air, it was in his head. A single sentence, looping like a reel. "You kept us, now we'll keep you." He staggered toward the sink, splashed his face with cold water, and caught sight of his reflection. For an instant, his reflection didn't move. It stared back at him with its head slightly tilted, eyes dull, smile faint. He punched the mirror, the glass spidered and held. That afternoon, he drove to St. Mary's Cemetery with his camera wrapped in a towel. The sky was thick with low clouds, and thunder murmured like distant applause. He knelt by Matthew Lawson's grave again, this time without pretense of professionalism. "What do you want?" he whispered. The words vanished into the damp air. No answer. He took out the camera, lens cracked but functional enough to power on. The LCD flickered to life. No battery, no SD card, yet the display glowed. Through it, he saw the cemetery alive with movement, dozens of figures standing between gravestones, their outlines faint, like shadows made of fog. He turned slowly, nothing there, but in the camera, they watched him, still as breath. At the center stood the boy, same calm smile, one hand raised as if to wave. Gerald dropped the camera, heart thudding like gunfire. When he blinked, the lens had gone dark again. He stumbled back to the car and sat there, shaking. In the passenger seat lay a stack of envelope-sold receipts, unmailed invoices, and a letter he didn't remember writing. The envelope read, "To whom it may concern, Father Delaney." Inside, a handwritten confession. Not just about the photos, but everything: the staged angles, the online sales, the way he'd used grief to build a name. The letter ended with the line, "I think they know what I did." His signature at the bottom looked strange, hurried, as though written by someone imitating him. He tore it up, but guilt settled heavier than before. That night, as rain battered the windows, Gerald's phone buzzed once. No number, no notification, just a vibration that didn't stop. When he finally looked, the screen displayed a new album in his gallery app titled Live Photos. Every image was a looping clip, shot from the corner of his darkroom. In the clips, he sat editing photos that didn't exist, lips moving in silence. Behind him, the same shadow leaned closer frame by frame. By the last one, it stood inches away, the faintest whisper audible through the phone speaker, "Say thank you." He threw the phone against the wall. The whisper stopped. Then came a new sound, soft, deliberate footsteps in the hall. Gerald froze. The floorboards creaked closer until they reached the doorway. He turned slowly, heart pounding. The hall was empty, but the air had changed cold, almost metallic. On the wall, the framed portrait of a widow weeping at her husband's funeral had fogged over. Words began to form in the condensation, as though written from inside the glass. We remember. By morning, he'd packed a bag. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to leave the studio, the cameras, the city. He rented a small cabin 2 hours north, deep in the woods where no one knew his name. No electricity, no internet, no neighbors, just quiet. He burned every print he'd ever made in a metal barrel out back, watching the faces curl into smoke. For a moment, it almost felt like release. But when the last flame died, something glimmered in the ashes, a strip of film that hadn't burned. He lifted it gently with trembling fingers. It showed one frame repeated 5 times, the darkroom empty, with words scrolled faintly across the wall behind his chair. He held the film to the light. The message was clear, letters warped by heat, but readable for you, Gerald. He dropped it into the barrel and walked back into the cabin, unaware that in the reflection of the window, the faint outline of a camera lens still watched him unblinking, waiting for the next shot. The cabin was supposed to be safe. Gerald had chosen it for its silence. A single-room wooden shell near the edge of a dried-up lake, too remote for mail or phone reception. He unplugged from everything. No cameras, no screens, no reminders of the life he'd made out of other people's endings. But silence has a way of speaking when you've got ghosts in your head. The first few days, he chopped wood, drank cheap whiskey, and tried not to think about the folder, the faces, or the boy in the coffin. Nights were worse, the dark pressed too close, and every creak of timber sounded like a shutter click. He started keeping a lantern burning, though he couldn't remember lighting it. The fuel never seemed to run out. He'd wake sometimes to find it glowing steady on the table, flame distilled to be natural. On the 5th night, the lantern went out. No wind, no sound, just the sudden suffocating black. He fumbled for matches but froze halfway. The darkness wasn't empty, it breathed. He could hear it, soft and slow, like someone exhaling through his own lungs. Then faint and sharp, the sound of a camera winding, the old mechanical kind, a roll of film being fed through gears. He whispered into the dark, "Stop it!" The air answered with another click. Then a flash, brief, blinding, and when his eyes adjusted, the lantern was lit again. Only now, on the table beside it, lay a photograph. It hadn't been there before. It was him, sitting exactly as he was now. Same shirt, same expression, but in the photo, there was someone else behind him, a shape. Not the boy this time, taller, the figure's face blurred, but the hands resting on Gerald's shoulders were unmistakably his own. He dropped the photo and stumbled outside into the cold, gasping for air. The forest loomed silent, no crickets, no wind. Then in the distance, a flicker of light, camera flash white, quick, deliberate, another and another. Like someone documenting his panic step by step. He shouted into the trees, "What do you want from me?" The flashes stopped. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he packed again at dawn, stuffing what little he had into his car. As he backed down the dirt road, his headlights caught something nailed to the cabin door, a photograph pinned under a rusted nail. He left the car running and approached slowly. The photo was of him, taken from behind, standing in front of that very door. His shadow stretched long into the forest, but in the picture, the shadow wasn't his. It was shorter, childlike. He ripped it down and drove until the trees thinned into fog. The highway was empty, miles of gray ribbon cutting through the hills. The radio, which hadn't worked in years, hissed to life. A single voice crackled through the static. "Do not keep us." He swerved, heart in his throat. The voice came again, softer this time, childlike. "Say it back." Gerald pulled over, shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the empty car. The voice didn't answer, but the static settled into a low hum that followed him the rest of the drive. He reached a motel by dusk, the kind where curtains never open and the manager doesn't ask questions. The mirror above the sink had a long crack through it. He covered it with a towel before turning out the light. Exhaustion finally pulled him under, but sometime near dawn, he woke to find the towel on the floor and the mirror clear again. Across the surface, written in condensation, was a message Room 12 remembers. He didn't know what it meant until he noticed the photo slid under the door. Another print, same grainy texture, same ghostly tone. This one showed the motel parking lot, his car out front. The timestamp in the corner read 3:17 a.m. in the reflection of the rearview mirror. Two pale faces looked out from the back seat. He stopped breathing for a moment, pulse roaring in his ears. He tore the photo to shreds, flushed the pieces, and packed again. But when he opened the motel door, every hallway wall was lined with prints. Hundreds of them, all of him, some from the funerals, some from nights he'd never remember. Each image caught him in a different moment of fear, realization, or flight. And in every one, just behind his shoulder, stood the boy from the coffin, patient as ever. He ran down the hall, through the lot, into the morning fog. Behind him, the doors of every room began to open, slow and synchronized, hinges groaning in unison like breath. And from each doorway, a single flash, small bursts of light, one after another like applause for the damned. He didn't look back, not then, but deep down, he knew the more he fled, the sharper the pictures would get. Karma wasn't chasing him anymore, it was composing him. Gerald didn't remember falling asleep behind the wheel. He only remembered waking to a sound like snapping film and finding his car stopped in the middle of nowhere, the engine cold. The road was gone, just fog, endless and white, pressing close to the windows. He checked his phone, but the screen refused to turn on. When he looked up, the fog had started to glow, faint and rhythmic, as if the air itself were pulsing. Then came the first flash, soft, far away, followed by another, closer. He stepped out of the car, boots sinking into damp gravel. The light seemed to move between the trees, darting in slow, deliberate circles, always staying just far enough to keep him following. Every few steps, he thought he heard the faint click of a camera shutter, steady and patient. By the time he reached the clearing, the fog had thinned enough for him to see what waited there. A dozen photographs hanging from a clothesline strung between two trees, fluttering like prayer flags. Each one showed him standing in this exact clearing, in the same posture, from slightly different angles, as though someone had been documenting his arrival long before he'd arrived. He reached for one, and the moment his fingers brushed the paper, the world flickered. For a heartbeat, the trees vanished, replaced by a room he knew too well, his studio drenched in dim red light. On the wall, pinned like insects, were hundreds of faces from every funeral he'd ever shot. Some smiled, some screamed, all turned toward him as though aware. Then, as quickly as it came, the vision was gone. The clearing returned and the photos on the line were blank, empty sheets, curling at the edges. He stumbled back toward the car, breathing hard, whispering to himself that this was all exhaustion, hallucination, guilt clawing at the corners of a framed mind. But when he reached the road, the car was gone. In its place stood a small wooden table, and on it, his Leica-polished hull, waiting. The same camera he'd smashed days ago, the lens shimmered faintly, catching light from no source. He should have left it, walked into the fog, disappeared. Instead, his hands moved on their own, lifting the camera, pressing the power button. The display came alive. A live view appeared on screen, not the clearing, not the road, his old studio again, empty except for a chair facing the lens. On the chair sat a figure, head lowered, hands folded in its lap. He zoomed in. The face that looked up was his own. He staggered backward, dropped the camera. The image didn't vanish. It stayed on the screen, flickering like an old broadcast. His reflection in the glass wasn't aligned anymore. It smiled when he didn't. Then the reflection spoke, voice flat, almost tender. "You took us, now we'll take you." The screen went black. When it came back on, a countdown timer appeared. 12 o'clock. It began ticking down, slow, 1 second at a time. Gerald ran through fog, through forest, through memory. The timer ticked behind his ribs, each beat louder than the last. When he finally saw lights ahead of Farmhouse, maybe he sprinted toward it, hammering on the door. No answer. The house looked abandoned, but the porch light flickered, steady like a metronome. He pushed the door open and froze. Every wall was covered in photographs, floor to ceiling. Candles burned low beneath them, their smoke trailing upward like threads. He stepped closer. The first picture was of a young couple holding a newborn. He remembered taking it. The husband had died a week later, car crash. The next was of a woman in black, clutching a folded flag. He remembered her to military funeral rain. The next and the next, every single photo he'd ever taken. He ran his hand along the wall, whispering names he'd forgotten but now recalled like confessions. When he reached the far corner, his hand stopped. The last photo was of him. Not behind a camera this time, but lying in a coffin, eyes closed, hands crossed neatly on his chest. He stepped back, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "No." The floor creaked behind him. A faint hum filled the air, the sound of a shutter resetting. He turned slowly. The room was empty except for a single camera mounted on a tripod at the far end, pointed straight at him. The flash fired. For a moment, everything went white. When his vision cleared, the walls were bare, no photos, no candles. Just one framed picture resting on the mantel. He walked closer and stared. It was the same image as before him in the coffin, but now, faintly reflected in the glass, he could see movement. A slow blink, a breath, his own chest rising inside the frame. He touched the glass and the warmth met him from the other side. Outside, the fog swallowed the house whole, leaving only the soft, rhythmic click of a camera somewhere in the distance, patient, steady, eternal. The light didn't fade the way normal light does. It stayed in the corners of Gerald's eyes, a ghost of white that refused to dim no matter how long he blinked. He stumbled through the empty house, walls humming like a living thing, his vision filled with afterimages of every flash he'd ever triggered. The air smelled of film and smoke and something faintly sweet, lavender, maybe, or memory pretending to be mercy. He found the door and pushed it open, stepping into a night so still it might have been waiting for him. The fog was gone, replaced by a strange, endless twilight that flattened everything into grayscale. The world looked like one of his photographs, beautiful, lifeless, precise. He started walking, camera still in his hands, though he didn't remember picking it up. Each step echoed like it belonged to someone else. Behind him, faint but constant, came the soft horror of a film reel turning. He didn't need to look to know it was following him. When the next flash came, he didn't flinch. The light rolled across the field like lightning without thunder, and when it faded, he saw people, hundreds of them, standing silently in the distance. He recognized their faces, the widow who'd thanked him through tears. The father who'd asked for one last good photo of his son. The boy from the coffin at the center of them all. They didn't move, they didn't breathe, but every time he blinked, they were closer. Gerald lifted the camera to his eye. The lens didn't show what was in front of him, it showed his studio again, but this time filled with these same people, standing in neat rows, looking into the lens as if waiting for direction. His own voice came from somewhere inside the static. Say goodbye, then another flash, and the image changed. The studio was empty now, only one chair in the center. The same one from before, the same one he'd seen himself sitting in. He lowered the camera, but the chair was there now too, right in front of him in the field. A single candle flickered on its seat. The flame burned white, steady, unbothered by wind. He stepped closer. The faces surrounding him began to shift, soft edges bleeding into light. The boy spoke first, voice quiet but perfectly clear. "You took from us, now give back." Gerald shook his head. "I didn't mean to. You kept us," the boy said. "You kept what wasn't yours." Another flash erupted, blinding him. When his sight returned, the faces were gone. Only photographs remained, thousands of them, covering the ground, curling in the cold air like fallen leaves. Each one was of him, caught mid-movement, mid-regret, mid-denial. And in every photo, the light seemed to be moving closer, swallowing his outline one frame at a time. He tried to run, but the ground shifted beneath him, soft and uneven like wet paper. The photos beneath his feet began to fade, ink bleeding outward until nothing was left but silhouettes. The world around him trembled, pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't his. The candle flame leaned toward him, stretching like a hand. He heard the whisper again, softer this time, almost kind. "Every flash leaves something behind." Then the light rose, swallowing the field, the camera, the faces, everything. For a moment, there was no fear, no sound, only the soft hum of a shutter closing for the last time. When the world returned, he was standing in a room that looked like his studio, but older, smaller, stripped bare. The Leica sat on the table. Beside it lay a single undeveloped roll of film, labeled in his own handwriting. The last session, he reached for it, knowing what it meant, but unable to stop himself. The light flickered once more, and he understood the flash hadn't faded. It never would. It was inside him now, eternal, waiting to develop. Outside, dawn crept over the horizon, but the sky remained a shade too bright, as though it had been overexposed. And somewhere, far away, the slow turn of film continued, a reel that would never stop spinning, a memory that would never release its image. The studio felt smaller than he remembered, or maybe it had always been this size and he had only just noticed how tight Gil could make a room. Dust floated through pale morning light, turning the air to fog. The Leica sat where it had been in his vision, patient as a stone. Beside it, the roll of film waited, label written in his own hand, but in a script he didn't quite recognize, more fluid, almost tender, the last session. He turned the roll over between his fingers, half expecting it to feel hot. It didn't, just cold, like something that had been waiting too long. He found his old and larger, the sink, the chemicals. Every bottle was full, though he hadn't bought supplies in months. The place smelled exactly the way it had when he first started photographing the dead fixer. Faint decay, the sharp tang of something chemical and permanent. He told himself he'd developed the film just to end it, to prove it empty. That was how guilt always worked for him, the promise of control disguised as curiosity. He loaded the reel in the dark, hands trembling, hard counting seconds. The sound of water running through the pipes seemed too loud, too alive. When he poured the developer, the first image began to appear almost instantly. No exposure should form that fast. He leaned closer. The outlines sharpened, a chair, a man, and in the man's hands a camera. His stomach dropped. It was him, mid-shot, expression calm, resigned. He processed the next frame and the next, each one closer, until by the 10th exposure the image filled the page, his own eyes staring into the lens, pupils reflecting 1,000 faint silhouettes behind him. He dropped the film into the sink, but the water ran dark, not red-black, thick, glossy. A low hum filled the room, the same sound his camera made when winding film. The Leica sat still on the table, yet its shutter clicked once, slow and deliberate. He lifted it out of instinct. The viewfinder was no longer glass, it was a mirror. His reflection looked older, skin ashen, eyes hollow. He took one step back, the reflection didn't. A cracked Leica camera on a table beside handwritten notes labeled the last session, detailed still life, cinematic shadow. Behind the mirrored version of himself, movement began to ripple, faces forming in the darkroom shadows, the people he'd photographed over the years. Not ghostly, not monstrous, just human, tired, watching. He felt his throat tighten. "What do you want?" he whispered again. The boy stepped forward this time, his edges no longer blurred. "You wanted to keep us," he said. "Now see what you kept." The faces behind him turned slightly, aligning their gaze with Gerald's, forming a circle around the mirrored version of himself. The Leica shutter clicked again. Light exploded across the room, but this flash didn't fade. It poured through him, bright and endless, burning away shape and color until all that remained was outline. He could feel it, something pulling, peeling, lifting. His body still stood in the studio, hands locked around the camera, but he was moving out of it, unfolding into light. The faces came closer, not to drag him down, but to surround him. They weren't angry anymore, just present. Every soul he'd stolen was returning itself to him in pieces of light and shadow. When the brightness finally dimmed, the studio was empty. The film floated in the sink, dried and stiff. Only one image remained undeveloped, stuck to the bottom of the tray. It was him, yes, but not behind the camera this time. He was in front of it, lying peaceful, eyes closed, faint smile on his lips. On the back of the photograph, in neat handwriting, read the words, "Thank you for keeping us." Father Delaney would later find the studio door unlocked, the air heavy with the smell of photochemicals and rain. On the table sat the leaker, still warm to the touch. The film inside was blank, every frame, every exposure pure white, as if the camera had captured nothing but light itself. And from that day forward, every camera left in that room, no matter who used it, produced the same thing: photographs washed empty, pure light, soft and endless. As if the place had finally run out of shadows. By the time anyone dared reopen Gerald's studio, months had passed. The landlord had sealed it off after the priest's report: unexplained disappearance, chemical fumes, unsafe premises, but curiosity, like grief, never really dies. It just waits for a quieter season. A young photographer named Maddie and finally leased the space, drawn by its rent and its light. She didn't know its story at first. To her, it was just another forgotten workspace with good northern windows. She brought her own cameras, her own reels, her own ambitions. On her first morning, she noticed a faint engraving carved into the work table, the last session. She smiled at it, assuming some artist's private joke. But the place had a low, electric undercurrent that didn't quite match the silence of an empty room. She spent her days cleaning, setting up her equipment, testing exposures. Everything came out perfect except one roll. No matter what she shot, flowers, glass, her own reflection, every image on that particular roll developed wrong. The negatives weren't blank, they weren't burned. They were reversed, inverted to a level that shouldn't exist, as though someone had photographed light itself from the other side. She hung them by the window to dry. That night, while she sorted her prints, the negatives began to move. Slowly at first, curling inward, the dark shapes inside them shifting like smoke. Then came the whisper, soft, almost tender, "Do not keep us." Maddie froze. The air smelled of old chemicals and something floral. She checked the window, it was closed. The sound didn't stop. "Do not keep us." The voice wasn't menacing, more like pleading. She leaned closer, and as she did, one of the negatives unfurled itself, swaying gently until it touched the table. The image had changed. It was no longer her test shot, it was a man's face. Older, hollow-eyed, mouth half open as if mid-word. The name came to her without knowing why. "Gerald," she whispered. The film trembled in response, and for the briefest second, the faint echo of a shudder filled the room. The next morning, she found her digital camera full of images she hadn't taken, the studio empty, bathed in faint gray light, and always in the same corner a single chair, with a candle burning beside it. The timestamp on each file was the same, 12 a.m. She deleted them, but they returned each time she powered the camera back on. The candle flame flickered slightly in each frame, moving like a heartbeat. When she developed her next roll, every photo bore a faint watermark in the lower corner, letters etched in soft white, "For you." She decided to leave the film for the night, unsettled but curious. Around midnight, she woke to the sound of soft clicking, the unmistakable rhythm of a camera taking photos in rapid succession. She rose, heart pounding, and stepped into the darkroom. The red safety light glowed dimly, steady as breath. Her camera sat on the counter, lens pointed toward the door. The shutter clicked once more, the flash fired. She shielded her eyes. When she lowered her hand, the room was empty except for one new print floating in the rinse tray. Her hands shook as she lifted it. The picture was of her, standing in that exact spot, eyes closed, light spilling across her face like grace. There was a note written beneath it in pencil. "We remember." "Let us go." Maddie left the studio before dawn, locking it behind her. She mailed the key to the landlord with a short note. The light never stops. A week later, when he entered to inspect, the space was quiet, empty, air smelling faintly of lavender and burnt film. On the table sat one final photograph, an empty chair beside a lit candle. The flame looked real, frozen mid-flicker. Beneath it, barely visible, a single handwritten line. "The flash never fades. No one rented the studio after that." Locals say the windows still glow at midnight, faint and rhythmic, as though the room itself were still developing something. And if you stand outside long enough, some swear you can hear the shutter, slow, patient, eternal. By the third winter, the building was empty but never still. Neighbors swore the windows fogged and cleared like lungs, the glass misting over even on the driest nights. Some said it was the heat from old pipes, others said it was memory. The landlord boarded up the front door after kids dared each other to break in. They came back white-faced, whispering about photographs still hanging in midair, turning slowly as though suspended by breath. The town eventually stopped talking about it, the way small towns do, folding tragedy into silence. But the place still stood at the end of Mercer Street, the old Huxley studio, a thin shell around something that had forgotten how to rest. No one knew what drew the priest back. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. Father Delaney had outlived most of his parishioners, his sermons reduced to sparse attendance and softer faith. When the letter arrived and signed, postmarked from nowhere, he nearly threw it out. But the handwriting on the envelope stopped him. It was faint, hurried, and familiar. Inside, a single photograph and a note. The photo was of the studio interior, the same as always: the chair, the candle, the endless stillness. But this time, the light in the image wasn't steady. It bled out through the edges like something trying to escape the frame. The note beneath it said only, "It's breathing again." Delaney went alone. He carried no holy water, no cross, just a small camera, an old habit from his youth. When he pried open the boarded door, the smell of fixer hit him first, sharp, metallic, layered over something faintly floral. The air pulsed once, warm then cold. He whispered Gerald's name, just to test the echo. It came back softer, two syllables fading into the hum of the walls. The room was dim but not dark. Dust moved in lazy spirals through thin light leaking from the ceiling cracks. He approached the table where the Liga once sat. It wasn't there now, only a stack of photographs face down. He turned one over. It was him, just as he stood, hand outstretched, mouth half open. The second showed him closer. The third, closer still, his own breath hitched. Then came the sound, a low inhale that didn't belong to him. The walls creaked inward, the air thick with static. From the far corner, the candle ignited on its own, flame white as a flashbulb. In that glow, he saw outlines gather, shapes he couldn't name, faces blurred by light, forming around the chair like witnesses. The boy was among them, not menacing, not sorrowful, just steady, as though waiting for the last photograph to be taken. Delaney fell to his knees. "He's gone," he said aloud. "You've had him. Let him go." The candle flickered, and the boy spoke not with sound, but through the vibration in the air. "He's still developing." The priest wept, the kind of tears that come not from fear but recognition. He set his camera gently on the floor, lens facing the light. "Then finish it," he said. The flash came not from the candle, but from everywhere at once. When his vision returned, the room was empty again, but quieter than before, like something had finally exhaled. The boarded windows no longer fogged, the hum faded, the air stilled. Outside, the priest's camera lay cracked, but not broken. Inside the last frame on its roll was a photograph of an empty room. No chair, no candle, only a wall, faintly marked by light shaped like wings. From that night onward, the studio stayed cold, silent, and according to anyone who dared stand close enough, completely ordinary. But those who passed by at midnight sometimes claimed to hear one soft sound, like a breath being released after holding too long. They said it was the room learning to stop keeping. Years pass differently after a haunting ends. The studio sat empty, but its story did not. The town carried it like a rumor, too heavy to drop. People called it cursed, but not in the way of horror, more like a mirror no one wanted to look into. Gerald Huxley became a name they spoke softly, followed by silence, the way you talk about someone who taught a lesson at the cost of their soul. Time smoothed over the fear, leaving only faint outlines, the house, the chair, the endless light. Yet every winter, when fog settled thick over Mercer Street, a glow would seep through the boarded windows. Not bright, not sinister, just steady, like the last exhale of a shutter that never quite closed. No one took a photograph there again. The landlord eventually turned the space into a storage unit, its concrete floor swept clean, its walls painted over. But paint can't hide what the air remembers. People who worked inside said their phones drained faster, screens flickering white when they passed the far corner. A few caught images they didn't mean to, half-formed faces, a child's outline near a candle flame. None of it made sense, but all of it felt personal. The longer they stayed, the more they found themselves whispering, apologizing to no one in particular. The light bulbs in that corner always burned out first. Years later, a traveling exhibit passed through town. Forgotten Eyes, photography of the departed. Maddie Ann, older now, curated it. She'd left the industry years ago, but returned to finish what Gerald started, only differently. Her display didn't show death, not exactly. It showed the hands of the living, the ones left behind, holding nothing, holding air. She titled the final piece "The Last Session." It was a single image, an empty studio chair illuminated by soft light. No faces, no ghosts, just space where something sacred used to breathe. On opening night, a journalist asked her where she took the photo. She smiled faintly. "Somewhere that taught me not to keep things," she said. The reporter laughed lightly, not understanding, and wandered off. Maddie stayed until the crowd thinned, her eyes fixed on the photograph. For a moment, she swore she saw it flicker just once, like a flash from inside the frame. A faint hum followed, familiar as heartbeat, and then silence. She didn't look away, but she didn't touch it either. Some debts were better left paid. That night, when the gallery lights went dark, the photograph kept its own glow for a few seconds longer. Security cameras caught it, a soft, expanding bloom of light that faded without source or sound. The footage spread online, labeled paranormal by some, edited by others. Maddie never responded to the speculation. She didn't need to. The people who'd stood in front of that picture, even briefly, carried something home with them, a stillness that settled under their skin, a sense that someone somewhere had finally put the camera down. And maybe that was the real ending. Not punishment, not redemption, just release. The light still lingers, yes, but only in the way old kindness lingers after guilt learns to let go. So if you ever find yourself walking past Mercer Street on a quiet night and see a faint white glow behind boarded windows, don't take a photo. Don't stop to record it. Just stand there a moment and feel the air steadying itself. That's not a haunting, it's a breath. And somewhere in that breath, between flash and fade, between what's kept and what's finally returned, Gerald Huxley is still taking his last picture, one frame forever in motion, until every shadow learns to rest in the light it made.